Have you fallen into an open manhole recently? Do you find yourself in the company of strangers? Well, then you might very well be in the feature Underground. One review after another, my name remains Hunter Lanier, and I am here yet again, but now, as you might be able to see, I am back from Fantastic Fest, back in my cozy study, now with a review of Paul Thomas Anderson's latest film, One Battle After Another, which I did get to see in IMAX. A new Paul Thomas Anderson movie is as big a cinematic event as I can think of, so it is exciting to finally be able to talk about this one. And needless to say, this video will have no spoilers, but of course, I will be talking about the movie, about things that happen in the movie, aside from the main plot. So if you don't want to know anything, it is best that you just go watch the movie if you can, and come back later. When I was younger, I would very closely follow the production of movies that I was looking forward to. I can remember following the making of Seven Psychopaths, because I was such a big fan of In Bruges. I remember following To Rome with Love because I was such a big fan of Midnight in Paris. In fact, I remember when To Rome with Love was called Nero Fiddled. While I didn't follow the making of One Battle After Another in that same way, if I stumbled upon an article about its production and what was happening, I found myself unable to ignore that article. And I remember during the production cycle of this film and some of the early word, a lot of it was centered around the idea that this was going to be Paul Thomas Anderson's most accessible and friendly film to a general audience. On a macro level, on a broad story level, this is true. One Battle After Another has a far more traditional story structure and character dynamics than we're used to seeing from Anderson. The characters in the film can largely be divided into good guys and bad guys. Although the good guys, there's a little more moral wiggle room there, since they are technically domestic terrorists. That's all to say, there's not as much character nuance this time around, but what the characters lack in nuance, they more than make up for in vibrancy. They are extremely vivid, burlesque versions of the aged left-wing radical who is so stoned that he can't remember the password to his own militant organization. Or the crew-cut, tight-ass military man who really doesn't want you to think he's gay, even though he wears a really tight shirt. The story itself is very propulsive. It's constantly moving. It's less about sitting in the still water with Daniel Plainview and seeing what kind of bacteria grows. It's more about being in a rushing river and catching glimpses of all the crazy scenery that's around you. In the plot itself, for as winding and as rocky as it is, it does take the more traditional route. Lest there be any confusion, I don't think this is Paul Thomas Anderson suddenly playing it safe or he's run out of original ideas. I get the impression that he legitimately wanted to make a more accessible movie for a broader audience and assembled the scaffolding of the story with that in mind. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the movie, the moment-to-moment, the dialogue, the character flourishes, I don't think he could help himself, because that stuff is anything but conventional. It's as out there as anything in Boogie Nights or Inherent Vice. And that's where, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think the movie is at its strongest. Basically everything that's not the main plot. Because when you're hanging out with DiCaprio's character Bob and his daughter's karate instructor Sergio, as they're flying down the highway, downing Modelo's, outrunning the cops, there is nowhere on planet Earth that you would rather be. I almost came to resent this movie's unceasing momentum because so many times I found myself wanting to stay with the characters in the scene we were in. In fact, let's just go ahead and talk about the characters, because the characters, as they should be, are the star of this show. I think people still put Leonardo DiCaprio in that 90s teen heartthrob box, in that same league as Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, the handsome movie star guy category, where you kind of hate them because they're really good looking and talented. But I think DiCaprio is so much more in that late 60s, early 70s sewer rat category of like Jack Nicholson and Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, especially Jack Nicholson, because DiCaprio is so, for as great a dramatic actor as he is so funny. And in the same way that Nicholson could go back and forth so seamlessly from drama to comedy in the same scene, so can DiCaprio. There's this whole bit in the movie where Bob is on the French 75 hotline. And the French 75 is the militant group that Bob was a part of. They're kind of like the Weather Underground. And apparently they have their own hotline. And Bob is trying to get information, but the stickler on the other end won't tell him anything unless he remembers the password. But Bob has drank so much and smoked so much pot in the past 15 years that he can't remember anything. As DiCaprio is going back and forth with this guy, his compounding fury, him rocking back and forth, clenching his teeth, calling this guy names, it's just so easy to imagine Jack Nicholson playing this role, 50 years ago. And now I ask, how many times is DiCaprio going to have to deliver these hilarious performances before we can admit that he is one of our great comic actors and maybe one of, if not the funniest leading men ever? Even in a movie like Killers of the Flower Moon, which I don't think anyone looks back on as being especially humorous, DiCaprio in that movie is hilarious. Never in a honk honk, look at me kind of way. It always just springs naturally from the character. Like, it's just in his delivery, in the pauses, in the sideways glances, just all the little mannerisms. He just has a natural comic timing. You really see this in a scene in the movie where Bob is playing dad to his daughter, Willa. He's worried about her friends who are coming to pick her up to go to a party. And he gives them the old classic dad speech about, if you mess with my daughter, you'll be breathing through a tube the rest of your life. Another amazing sequence later in the movie, he's got this 1G ancient cell phone that's untraceable. And he's trying to charge it, but he has to keep moving, so he keeps unplugging it and trying to find new plugs. I could go on and on about how funny DiCaprio is in this. Now let's talk about Benicio Del Toro's character. And yes, I am going to spend a large amount of this review talking about the characters because they're that great. Benicio Del Toro's character, Sergio, he's not a main character, but he may be the most original and memorable character in the entire movie. Everyone else in the film feels like they can fit into some kind of model, but not Sergio. Sergio, the sensei, truly feels like his own man. Bob goes to Sergio after everything hits the fan. Unlike Bob, whose heart rate is always in the triple digits, Sergio's chi is completely centered, and he guides Bob through all of the gunfire, explosions, and police chases as if he's just ringing up groceries at Whole Foods. The absolute confidence with which Sergio guides Bob through all of this chaos makes him the perfect abbot to DiCaprio's stammering Costello. And there are so many different ways that you could play that character of Sergio, but Del Toro adds so much to the character by giving him this kind of, and I don't know if this was just Del Toro's decision or Paul Thomas Anderson or who, but he gives him this dash of spaciness. It's as if Sergio has seen God, and God unloaded upon him all of the secrets of the universe, that all of this is headed to a benevolent end. And Sergio carries the calmness of that knowledge with him everywhere. That's the best way I can describe his attitude. I don't really care what needs to be done to make it happen, but I want a Bob and Sergio spin-off movie, story, book, whatever. If it's a movie, I don't want David Fincher to direct it either. All right, now we have to talk about Sean Penn. Although I'm actually going to use his character to bring up something else about the film that I noticed pretty early on, then I'll come back to the character. When the film starts, it's very serious. It's even shot in a very sparse and almost like cinema verite kind of style. There's no flamboyance to the way the camera moves, but this mood starts to shift as soon as characters start talking and you start finding out the names of characters. For example, the character played by Teyana Taylor is named Perfidia Beverly Hills. Perhaps the most nefarious organization in the film call themselves the Christmas Adventurers, and always with the straightest of faces. When you take all of this goofy dialogue into consideration with the simplistic plot and the unambiguous characters, it starts to become clear that One Battle After Another is an exploitation movie. And no character speaks to that more than Sean Penn's character of Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw. He feels plucked right out of a Russ Meyer movie. And in fact, the scene in which we are introduced to him feels plucked right out of a Russ Meyer movie, and you will know exactly why when you see it. Lockjaw is a monstrous cartoon parody of every scary old hardass. He is the arch villain of 70s exploitation cinema, in that he is the mean old disciplinarian who secretly enjoys all of the things he condemns. Hell, this movie even ends in the same Arizona-looking desert that Super Vixens ends in. I could be wrong, but Sean Penn strikes me as being one of the more humorless people on the planet. And this movie actually leverages that to make him funny. That's good casting, because if a funny person was playing this role, they would be trying to play up the character's seriousness to make it funny. With Sean Penn, you don't have to worry about that. And he is phenomenal as Lockjaw. I thought Liam Neeson was going to win the award this year for saying the most absurd dialogue in the most straight-faced way, but Sean Penn has him beat now. Since they both came out the same year and both satired the current state of culture to varying degrees, it's hard not to think of Eddington in relation to One Battle After Another. But I say varying degrees because the two movies are actually very, very different. Eddington is much more of a pointed social satire. It has a viewpoint and is hyper-specific about recent real-world events. One Battle After Another isn't really topical at all, aside from a few jokes about social fads and technology. Its story is universal in that you have a private militia who is trying to overturn the prevailing order. You have a military who is trying to maintain the current order. You have an immigration conflict. You have fathers looking for their daughters. You have absentee parents. These are all universal qualities. You could take the plot of One Battle After Another and you could drop it almost anywhere on the planet and almost anywhere on the timeline. Eddington, on the other hand, is about COVID. It's about this new burgeoning relationship with social media and how this new trend of seeing the world through screens is altering our perception and our behavior. What's more, there is an intentional vagueness to One Battle After Another, in that we kind of know it's modern America, but they never mention politicians, they don't mention recent events. There's nothing that grounds it specifically in our time. And I say that's intentional because that's gonna help the movie age, and it helps the movie, translate to cultures that aren't ours. So while Eddington is a satire, I would say One Battle After Another uses satire. But overall, it is an exploitation movie. It's a fun, crazy exploitation movie. Car chases have a very long and storied history, and I am happy to say that One Battle After Another has a great one. It's unique for a few reasons, but I want to talk about specifically how it uses the desert terrain. A character is being chased, and you can't tell how far behind the pursuer is because of the way the hills are rolling. So every time the person looks back to see if they're being pursued closely, you just see these big imposing hills, and you can't see the car because it's going down one of them. It creates this tension where you never know how close the car is. It's a car chase that's less like the French Connection and more like Spielberg's Duel, because it's not so much about the excitement of the chase as much as it's about the dread of being caught. And as I said before, I was lucky enough to see the movie in IMAX. And as you might imagine, that big IMAX image really accentuates the prominence of those rolling hills and just the vacuousness of the desert landscape. By now, it should be obvious that I enjoyed One Battle After Another quite a lot. But that said, I would put it toward the bottom of the Paul Thomas Anderson filmography. And there's no shame in that. I don't think the man has made a bad movie. I think his worst movie is most people's best movie. But the reason I'm putting it toward the bottom is that I don't think it's as silly and fun as Boogie Nights or Inherent Vice. And I don't think it has the literary depth of There Will Be Blood or The Master. Okay, everyone, this is going to be a brief spoiler section. Spoilers will be abound here. I'm going to talk about the ending a little bit. If you keep watching and you haven't seen the movie, this is all your fault. But I didn't want this review to end without me talking about one of my favorite scenes and one of the best scenes, I think, in any Paul Thomas Anderson movie. I'm talking about the scene at the very end when Lockjaw has completed his transformation into a monster. They tell him he is officially a Christmas adventurer and walk him to his new office. The giddy look on Lockjaw's face as he steps into that office, which isn't even that nice, and sits down at his new desk, tears welling up in his defunct eye. It hits you as the audience in that moment that all the diabolical and heinous things that he's done throughout the movie, it was all for this IKEA-looking office. And the kicker is that you can see in his face that to him, it was all worth it. In that moment, he thinks he's won at life. I will say, I don't know if I like the fact that they kill him. I think it's funnier if he wins in his own way. I think that would have been the funnier ending. And speaking of the Christmas adventurers, I gotta say, I loved the whole shtick of Hail Saint Nick. It's like something that's from a lost Arrested Development episode. And, I was talking earlier about how DiCaprio is this great comic actor. I think there's an alternate reality where Paul Thomas Anderson became a writer on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jim Downey is in this movie and was also in There Will Be Blood. Paul Thomas Anderson clearly has a great affection for comedy writing. And while we're on the subject of endings, the stuff I was talking about earlier about the traditional plot that I wasn't big on, you see a lot of that with the ending of the story of Bob and Willa. It's just a little too neat and cutesy for my taste, especially the whole thing with her reading the letter, which I just thought was corny. To me, this is an example of the movie trying to be more accessible, giving the audience an ending that they can recognize and feel good about. Although I do like how Bob's story ends with him taking pictures of himself on the couch. Well, those are all my thoughts on One Battle After Another. Now is the time for you to let me know your thoughts on my thoughts. Next up for me, however, I will be reviewing If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. I actually saw that at Fantastic Fest. I saw it before I saw One Battle After Another, but One Battle After Another comes out before If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. What's with all these long titles? So I figured I'd get this review out first. But the review for If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You is on its way. Until then, I leave you with the always comforting knowledge that every day underground is a good day.